One of the main themes of our course is to think about how we define world history, and I ask you throughout the course, what is world history? So, in addition to the readings we'll do, I'd like to give you some general guidance on some of the main themes of how we recognize what are the characteristics of world history. A good place to start is to understand that world history is the history of a species. That means it's the history of humanity writ large, humans of all times, of all places, and all walks of life. So we're not studying a specific nationality, a specific ethnic group, a specific region. We're studying the human experience over a long period of time. And when we think of periodization, another one of our main factors in thinking about world history, we're thinking about quite a long time, about 250,000 years, which is how long we know probably for sure that human beings have been around on Earth. Most of that time, or about 240,000 years, human beings lived as foragers, which means hunter-gatherers. It's only in the past 12,000 years or so, 10,000 years or so, that we've seen human beings turn to agriculture and build civilizations. So, humans have been around for about 250,000 years. About 240,000 years of that period we call the Paleolithic, or the Old Stone Age, and that lasted from about 250,000 years ago to about 12,000 years or so ago. About 12,000 years ago is when human beings started settling down and making the transition to agriculture. And so that time period, the New Stone Age, or Neolithic, is the period in which we also have what's called the Neolithic Revolution, or the Agricultural Revolution, which is when human beings began to build up larger and larger populations due to agricultural surplus. So world history includes this time period from 250,000 years ago to about 5,000 years ago, but as you can see in textbooks, it is usually the equivalent of about a chapter because it's before written history. It's before we had the opportunity to collect as much information as we have nowadays about dense urban populations. So world history starts to really concentrate on the human experience when humans start to build civilizations, or cities. That's what civilizations are, city-based societies. And we see that start to happen about 5,500 years ago, which is the same thing as saying 3,500 BCE, because BCE means, according to the Christian calendar, 3,500 years before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. So the Christian calendar is what generally guides our calendar keeping in the world today. So we have to be able to do a little bit of math. It is now 2017 CE, Common Era, and so 3,500 plus 2017 is about 5,500 years ago. Now, one of the things you'll see is that the dates for Paleolithic era, Neolithic era, and whatnot, early civilizations, might change a little bit. They're in the general ballpark. So the dates you see here, or the dates you see in the book, or the dates you see in another source, they'll probably all be pretty close. So don't worry about having an exact year, just have a general ballpark. So for our purposes, our first time period is the Paleolithic, and then we'll go right to the Neolithic, which I've asked you about, and we really start to dig in to the history of human beings when we get to 3,500 BCE, and our first time period goes to about 500 BCE, and this is when we see the first wave of agricultural-based societies building cities and large complex societies that we call civilizations. Once we get through this period, we'll see that the rest of human history we can also divide up into periods, one of the things that we'll be focused on. So we have the important factors of humanity, time period, and we have to remember that world history is characterized by a global perspective geographically. So world history divides up the globe not so much into continents but into regions and subregions. So we have the Americas of the Western Hemisphere, Africa, Eurasia, and Oceania. World history is less interested in national boundaries between nation-states or countries, and more interested in regions across which people interact. So, in addition to the major world regions that we have, there are also subregions, as you know. So we have North and South America, the Caribbean in between. Africa is generally divided at the first go-round in terms of Northern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, Sahara being the desert. Some world historians will also talk about an Afro-Eurasian world history region, which is completely legitimate. We also have the continent of Eurasia, which is divided into two parts for world history purposes primarily because of the cultural divide, since Eurasia is not really divided geologically or geographically. It's really one large continent. But that dividing line comes right about through here, and we speak in world history of a European region and an Asian region. Now, the Asian region is so huge, it gets subdivided as well into a Middle East region, South Asia, mostly India, Southeast Asia, and East Asia, China, Japan, Korea. And then finally, we have the ocean world, Oceania, rooted in Australia and the islands of Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia. So world history is interested in comparison of human societies in these different regions or subregions, or particularly it's interested in the connections between these regions, how people, ideas, and other things move across these spaces, immigration, disease, trade, and so on. So for example, 1500 is a major dividing point in world history, and it's often where we divide, say, a World History 1 and 2 course, because it's at around 1500, the end of the 1400s, when the Western Hemisphere is reunited with the Eastern Hemisphere by seagoing traders, travelers, and explorers. So, 4 main points for thinking about looking for world history characteristics and world history themes. One of them is world history as big picture. World history is about the entire history of humanity, or all humans. It can cover 250,000 years, but it can drop down into any time frame or period during those 250,000 years. And it's global in its reach, not restricted to a single nation or region, but it's looking at comparison between regions and subregions, or connections between regions and subregions. So world history can fit into any of these characteristics. It doesn't necessarily have to cover all 250,000 years, all humanity, or all regions, but it's focused on human experiences, it's focused on certain time periods, and it's looking at connections between regions, either comparatively or connections that cross those boundaries.